So our next speaker is going to be Bob Wing. We asked Bob to speak about the history of racial and national oppression of Asian peoples and put forward a vision of Black Asian unity. And I wanted to give y'all a little background as to why. As I said before, my name is Osali Hawkins, and I've lived here my whole life for 22 years. And I was a part of our organization's decision to invite Bob Wing. He has thought a lot about the racial oppression of both the Black community and also the Asian community. He has theorized about the development of white supremacy in the United States and racial categories and how that affected Black people as well as Asian peoples. In addition to laying out the history, we asked him to put forward a vision of not just the moral, but also the strategic necessity of an alliance between racially oppressed peoples. We, as poor and working class people who are also racially oppressed, must have the political clarity that even though our racial oppressions might sometimes look different, they are based on the same idea at the root. That people who don't have white skin are inferior.
I haven't met one yet.
You must see that we have a shared interest in fighting white supremacy and standing together. This is not a call to skip over the hard work of building unity that is principled. Many of us have stories of being mistreated at Chinese stores. We feel disrespected in our own community, as if we're criminals. Or that we feel like your stores shouldn't stay open so late or serve healthier food. But how many of us know the stories of how these people came to work at these Chinese stores? How many of us know what the working conditions are? Or why someone would choose to leave their country? Better yet, how many of us understand a world economic system that forces someone to leave their families and their country, often at great risk, travel across the world, come to a country to try to make a living where they don't even speak the language? We do need more dialogue. We need to address where we felt mistreated, and we need to hear where other people felt mistreated. But fundamentally, most importantly, we need a plan that is based on our interests, what will benefit us. Let me ask this, and whose interest is it? Who benefits from poor and working class, racially oppressed people spending their time hating each other? Let me say that one more time. And whose interest is it? Who benefits from poor and working class, racially oppressed peoples spending their time hating each other? We need people who aren't willing to participate in white supremacy's plan for us, which is that we fight one another. We need people from our respective communities to come together and make a plan for ourselves. Finally, I want to say, if we successfully start to mobilize a force of long-term Black residents demanding community control, then the response to developers is going to be to divide and conquer. They will try to divide Black people from other Black people, but they will also try to play on tensions between Black and Asian communities to get the Asian people who live in Point Breeze to side with yuppies and developers who are often white. If we allow ourselves to be divided like that, it will be much harder to win what we deserve. Win, y'all. Malcolm X said, "Tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today." And we're submitting to you that part of that preparation must be building political clarity about who our enemies are and who our enemies are not. This is the only way we can achieve self-determination. With that, the Point Breeze Organizing Committee is very excited to welcome up Bob Wing.
Obviously, y'all don't need me. But it was nice coming here. I'm really honored to be here. One of the greatest things about being an activist is to meet people all over the country who are trying to make a better life, and to hear their stories and their struggles, and to participate in whatever way that you can. So it's a real honor to be here. My little note about the civil rights movement is kind of connected to that. I think it's really important. The civil rights movement, what was it? It was y'all. You know, the names, even the famous names that have come down to us through the Civil Rights Movement, they weren't famous in 1955 or 1960. They were just regular folk who decided at a certain point that they weren't going to just be about survival anymore. They were going to take history into their own hands. They were going to be history makers. And that's what you folks are doing. That, you know, Fannie Lou Hamer is sitting in this room. Martin Luther King is sitting in this room. James Foreman is sitting in this room. The new James Foremans, the new Fannie Lou Hamers. Famous people, famous activists. Nelson Mandela. He's not some person from God. He's a regular person who decided to struggle and learned in the process. Learned in the process. You aren't born this way. You learn through struggle. And that's who you are. And don't separate yourselves from these people, which is what the media and everybody's trying to tell us. Martin Luther King was some special person sent down by God who it could only have been him. No, it's you. There was no Martin Luther King without us.
That's right.
Okay. What is up with Philadelphia? Do you know that people from Pennsylvania and Philadelphia move out of state or out of city less than any other state or city, big city in the country? What is up with Philadelphia? I want an answer. I'm not going to get it right now, but hey, when it comes to the question and answer, you don't just get to do questions. I want to know. Is it something? Do they tax you if you leave? A couple notes about me. I'm Chinese American. My family came here a long, 1854, before the Civil War, in the very first wave of Chinese immigrants during the gold rush. It's highly unusual. The overwhelming majority of Asians in the United States, they were born in Asia. So I'm kind of unusual in that respect. I became an activist in 1968, kind of a big year. And I was kind of politically, I became active in Oakland and Berkeley, so I was kind of a child of the Black Panther Party. And you know, the subject of this talk having to do with unity of Asians and blacks, it was mother's milk. There was really no choice in the matter at the time. That's who, you know, leadership is not a theory. Leadership is one on the ground. You know, we do try to theorize it and try to figure out who can lead, but the bottom line is who is actually leading. And those, and anybody else who wants to struggle will get in behind. You know, and at that time, there's no question that the black movement was far in the lead. I mean, it gave rise to the Asian American movement, which started in 1968. It gave rise to the Chicano movement. It gave rise to the new version of the women's liberation movement. It gave rise to the gay liberation movement. And, you know, I was privileged to be part of that. I want to tell a little story that has a lot to do with what it means to be Asian in the country. I think it was about 1970, and I happened to be in New York at an anti-war, anti-Vietnam War demonstration. And, you know, I'm marching down the street with tons of people. And some cat comes up to me, and he's got this serious Russian accent. I mean, he could barely understand him through the Russian accent. And he says to me, "If you don't like this country, go back to where you came from."
And he can't talk.
This happens in one form or another to just about every Asian in this country. Somehow, Asians are permanent aliens. Somehow, Asians can't be American. Somehow, we are permanently from Asia. I've been here, my family's been here since 1854, for God's sake. Dude, you got off the plane the other day. Quiet as it's kept, black people have been, on average, in the United States, longer than any group of people except Native Americans. They have been here longer on average than white folks. But whose country is it? And that's what we're about. That's what we're about trying to change. So let's just get on the for real. I mean, we may as well be for real. I mean, we can't be for real. We may as with each other. It's a problem. So, okay, what do people think? What's in your mind when you think of Asians? Anybody? What's in your mind? B, you know, just say it. Yes, ma'am.
Your textiles.
We're what?
Textiles.
Textiles. Okay. What else? We make textiles. Clothes. In manufacturing, like, think about Chinese manufacturing. I think that's what is that the reference? Yeah, yeah. Okay, what else? What else about Asian Americans besides the fact that we wear glasses?
Strong work ethic.
Strong work ethic, yes, yes, we're very hardworking. We're the only hardworking people in the world. What else? We're thrifty. Oops, we're cheap. Okay, I am the grandson of Chinese peasants. I am cheap. Not with myself, at least, not so much others. Yes, ma'am. We have dynasties. We have emperors. You know how one of the things about white people in the United States, or a lot of white people, is they all say, you know, they had an ancestor who came over on the Mayflower. Well, with Chinese, well, we all had ancestors who were emperors. Yeah. What else? Come on, you know you got some other stuff. Yes, sir. Or ma'am, I can't see whose hand in the back. Which was that? Chinese food and intelligence. Yes.
Now say you don't have that.
We're going to talk about this. Yeah. Insular communities. Insular communities. Okay, well, you know, one of the main things that is put up about Asians, y'all have touched on a lot of it, but kind of it gets bundled in a term called, we are the model minority, right? What is the model minority? The model minority is the hard-working, intelligent, thrifty, successful minority, and the family-oriented, dynastic minority. But the point of it isn't to describe Asians. The point of it is to say, black people and Latinos, what's wrong with y'all? It's a divisive concept. It is a concept meant to say, hey, Asians succeeded. What is wrong with the rest of you? And so we're going to try to unbundle what's up with the model minority, because I'm not going to try to say that it's all, at least in terms of the underlying reality. I hate the term. The term is a divisive term. But there's some realities to unbundle with it. Basically, the history of Asians in this country was completely shaped by slavery. Okay, we started the first wave of Asian immigrations were Chinese in 1852 during the gold rush to California. And what happened to us? They did the same thing to us that they did with black people, and they have subsequently done with other people of color. Fundamentally, the root of racism, the root of white supremacy, is to use racism, racial coercion, to get cheap labor, okay, with slavery. And that's what Chinese were in the 19th century. You don't have capitalism in California without cheap Chinese labor. One of the things about the United States that's different than a lot of other capitalist countries is it's always had a shortage of labor until recently. So they had to use coerced labor to have labor for capital, whether it was slavery or the Chinese or Mexican braceros. So Chinese coerced Chinese labor, labor that had no rights due to racism, was used to build agribusiness. Famous, California is really the first place in the world that had agribusiness, though unless you count, and you can count, plantation slavery as the first agribusiness. But aside from that, the United States was founded on a lot of small farmers. No capitalists. What a horrible thing, some people doing for themselves. So, you know, cheap labor had to be found, and that's what That's how and why Chinese were brought here. In fact, Chinese were even brought to Mississippi to try to, in an experiment, to try to replace blacks in plantation slavery. There's a whole book about the Chinese in Mississippi. Secondly, starting in 1882, there was a huge, well, the movement started early, but it was crowned in 1882, a powerful anti-Chinese movement, a movement to kick Chinese out of the country. Happened, and in 1882 they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which meant that the only Chinese who could come into the country, we were about 25% of the population in California at the time, the only Chinese who could come into the country were the sons and wives of Chinese merchants. And they drove, through anti-Chinese riots, drove the vast majority of Chinese labor out of California back to China. And so this was a complete transformation from a kind of becoming the main form of cheap labor to basically being excluded and locked into ethnic communities. It was the insular communities. Insular communities don't happen all by themselves. Insular communities for Asians were founded on racism. It was the form of segregation that was put upon Asians. The Chinese Exclusion Act was then extended to the Japanese and the Filipinos in 1924. Okay, so we had this, and one of the impacts of this, which goes back to our, quote, model minority thing, is that when Chinese labor and then Japanese labor and Filipino labor was largely chased out of the country and people were put in and kind of locked into insular Asian communities, any insular community has an unusual proportion of merchants, okay? And Chinese and Asian laborers being kicked out of the country, it gave rise to a very small Asian population. In 1960, there were only 1 million Asians in the whole country, 0.5% of the population, okay? But it was a population that had an unusual number of merchants because of being pushed into these ethnic enclaves. And this is where part of the whole thing about the Asian success is that because of racism, we became a community that had an unusual number of merchants and a very small number of laborers compared to the rest of the population. Both my grandparents were merchants, sent their kids to college. Okay, so in an odd way, the so-called success of Asians is connected to racism against Asians. The exclusion of Asian labor, the locking in of Asians into ethnic enclaves. Asians were not allowed to become citizens. As well as being locked out of the country, those who were here were not allowed to become citizens. My grandmother was born in the United States. She's the line that goes back to 1854. She was the third generation in the United States. She married my grandfather who was born in China. Wow, okay. She lost her citizenship as a result. There was a law, the form of anti-miscegenation law against Asians was that if you married an Asian who was ineligible to citizenship, meaning somebody born in Asia, you lost your citizenship. So these kinds of things, segregation, exclusion, etc., that were started with blacks were applied to Asians. I better hurry up, I got 5 minutes. The big thing was that today there are 18 million Asians in the country, from 1 million in 1960 to 18 million today. And the main reason for that, believe it or not, is the civil rights movement. One of the things that the civil rights movement won, not as one of its central goals, but it ended up, was finally getting rid of racism and immigration quotas. That's the final end of Asian exclusion. It doesn't happen until the 1965 Immigration Act, which gives rise to the huge immigration of Latinos and Asians. We are now 18 million people, 15% of the population. And we are trending heavily. You know, again, Asian black unity or people of color unity is a nice theory, but is it happening on the ground? And one of the wonderful things that is starting to happen, not at every level, is that it is starting to happen. And the clearest indicator is in elections, where in the last several elections, people of color have voted together in incredible numbers. In 1992, only 31% of Asian voters voted for Bill Clinton. 31% voted for Bill Clinton. The rest voted for Perot or Bush, the Republican. In 2012, 79% of Asians voted for Barack Obama. 79%. What is happening is that what happens with immigrants is we come here, even if we're of color, we think it's all about we're being discriminated against because we're from another country and we don't speak the language. We come to find out even that once we speak the language and we're born here, there's still racism, which is not the same as what happens to immigrants. And so there's a political awakening that happens, and this political awakening is happening in massive numbers with Asians today. And I guess the other thing, since I'm just really short here, is that because of immigration law, here's a fact that's very important. Asians who are born outside the country in Asia, which is way poorer than the United States, has way less education than the United States. Nonetheless, Asians in the United States, born in Asia, have a higher educational level than American-born Asians. What that means is immigration law is allowing in a very elite set of Asians. It is not primarily a labor migration as with Latinos. It is a migration of technicians, doctors, professionals. So again, the myth of the model minority is, oh, they worked hard, what's wrong with y'all? The real deal is that racism in the form of exclusion earlier and in the form of only allowing a very elite set of Asians in the country is the primary reason why you see this. And what it hides is the huge number of very poor Asians who are also victims of the model minority myth. And especially it's Southeast Asians whose socioeconomic profile is pretty similar, virtually the same as blacks and Latinos. So I guess I have to end, right? 2 minutes? So if I'm going to end, I'm going to end with since this is the unfinished business of the civil rights movement, I'm going to end on a quote from Dr. King. Now, by the way, when it comes to strategy, Dr. King was a serious strategist. He was not just a motivator, and if you might want to read his book, Where Do We Go From Here? The whole book is a book of strategy. This is Martin Luther King. We as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our country's past and present policies. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on the military than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. Thank you.
Brief, like 3 to 5 minute stretch break. We have a long program. There's food in the back, so stretch out a little bit, get some water or some food, and come back to your seats very, very soon so we can continue. Thank you.
5 minutes? How many minutes? 5!